Hello, I'm Rob Lyons. I'm the Science and Technology Director at the Institute of Ideas. Welcome to this session, Plantation Politics, Is Industrial Farming Bad for the Developing World? This session is called Plantation Politics, but I suppose we want to talk really more generally about where agriculture is going in the developing world. We're likely to have another 2 billion people on the planet by 2050, almost all of them in the developing world. So how will they be fed? How does agriculture fit into the idea of developing? Do we need to think purely about food, or should we think more broadly about economic development in its wider sense? Is big beautiful, or should we be focusing on supporting the millions of smallholders? What kinds of cash crops should we be growing? Should we be embracing large-scale monoculture cash crops like oil palms, or mixed farming? Do we need new technologies like genetic modification, or do they pose a risk? What's the best way forward for people and the planet? And to discuss all those things, we've got a very wide range of people with different expertise to come to this discussion, and I'll introduce them in the order that they speak. So on my far right is Marco Visscher. He's an independent journalist. He's curator of Tegengeluid. Is that right? Anywhere near?
I always laugh when you say it.
Sorry?
In Holland we would say Tegengeluid. But
Never mind. He's curator of that, which is a Dutch newsletter that aims to bring together the best writing that challenges conformist thinking. He's also editor-at-large at The Optimist. Second up is Dr. Steve Wiggins. He's a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London. He's been an agricultural economist who has for more than 40 years studied and taught agricultural and rural development, primarily in Africa and Latin America. His current studies include linking smallholders to markets, obesity in the developing world, and the role of agriculture in growth and economic transformation. Third to speak will be Leela Barrock in the middle here. She's Group Head of Group Communications and Corporate Affairs at the Malaysia-based multinational Sime Darby Berhad. She has worked on developing the group's corporate responsibility function, and since 2014 she's led the Secretariat for the Sustainable Palm Oil Manifesto High Carbon Stock Study. On my immediate left is Martin Wright, a writer, editor and advisor on environmental solutions and sustainable futures, with 25 years' experience in the field. As a journalist, he's been published widely, and he is chair of the editorial board of Collectively, the new sustainability platform launched at Davos. He was also launch director of Forum for the Future India, the Sustainable Futures non-profit advisory. Last but not least is Shahrar Ali. Shahrar was elected deputy leader of the Green Party in 2014, becoming in the process the first BME deputy of a UK parliamentary party. He entered green politics after working as a researcher in the European Parliament on the risks of GM foods. He also has a PhD in philosophy, looking at the role of lying and deception, particularly in public life. So I think you'll agree there's a broad range of different experiences and backgrounds there. So the panel will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each, outlining their kind of take on the question, and then we'll go out to you and, for comments and questions. So, Marco.
I used to work on the staff of a magazine that was very sympathetic to green ideas. I knew then GM is no good. It requires more chemical input, so it's harmful for the planet. It's expensive, so farmers end up in debt. GM was a very, very bad thing, invented by big American corporations that only serve the interests of their shareholders. It was what I read in The Ecologist, Red Pepper, New Internationalist, Resurgence. Those were the good guys. Today, I wouldn't write those kind of articles anymore. My shift is not as dramatic as that of another journalist who made a U-turn on this, Rob Lyons, maybe a well-known figure here in this audience. Also, I'm not as outspoken a proponent of GM, but I relate to him as I think we share a somewhat similar background and a similar shift in our thinking. Anyway, one day Rob Lyons said he was sorry for ripping up GM fields and campaigning against GM. Lyons said that what he discovered in the scientific literature was the opposite of what he held to be true. Pest-resistant cotton and maize appeared to need fewer chemical insecticides. Not only big companies, but also farmers were benefiting financially because they needed fewer inputs. It appeared that GM wasn't aggressively imposed on reluctant farmers, but farmers were eager to use them. It appeared that GM wasn't dangerous, but safer and more precise than conventional breeding. I met Rob Lyons last year in Oxford for an article I wrote, and he told me that what had changed his mind was science. I discovered science, he said. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on the science of GM, but I don't think it was very accurate of him to say that. Yes, he may have realized that the big meta studies analyzing all the GM studies show no environmental harm, and yes, he may have discovered that the studies that do show harm from GM crops are sometimes or often shoddy research or suspiciously paid for or done by lobby groups such as Greenpeace. But in my mind, facts are rarely things that change people's minds. I think there must have been something else going on. I suspect that Mark Lyons allowed himself to, and me too, by the way, allowed himself to consider the possibility that people aren't as bad as he had always assumed them to be. I think he realized that technology can actually be a good thing. These days, that is an unusual position to take. Today in the West, we seem far more concerned about what dangers are lurking out there to hurt us and damage our planet than what new possibilities might be waiting to be unleashed to boost our productivity and well-being. This sense of caution is best illustrated, I think, by the institutionalization of the precautionary principle, which is an approach to risk that prefers to protect the public from exposure to any potential harm and halt new technologies, rather than to explore and discover what innovation might bring. And what may be even worse is that environmental groups have been spreading this fear to Africa, India, and the rest of Asia, where GM is banned. And by doing so, environmentalists are putting a brake on development, because that's what I believe environmentalists do. They hold a deeply conservative outlook and dress it up as a concern for the planet while they're obstructing technological advancement. It doesn't need to be that way, and it's not a position that environmentalists need to adopt. Let me give you a quote, if I may, a rather lengthy quote. A truly extraordinary variety of alternatives to the chemical control of insects is available. Some are already in use and have achieved brilliant success. Others are in the stage of laboratory testing. Still others are little more than ideas in the minds of imaginative scientists waiting for the opportunity to put them to the test. All have this in common. They are biological solutions based on understanding of the living organisms they seek to control and of the whole fabric of life to which these organisms belong. Specialists representing various areas in the vast fields of biology are contributing entomologists, pathologists, geneticists, physiologists, biochemists, ecologists, all pouring their knowledge and their creative inspirations into the formation of a new science of biotic controls. Now, all this optimism came from none less than Rachel Carson. This is from her seminal work, Silent Spring, published in 1962, which is like a Bible for Greens. So in the 60s, when nobody used the term biotechnology, the one biologist and conservationist who has advanced the environmental movement so much actually had a dream of science-based agriculture to help control weeds and pests and disease and feed the planet. Now I'd say it's time for Greens to take a moment for some critical self-reflection like Mark Lyons did and assess whether their obstruction of GM is hurting the planet and the world's poor that they claim to protect.
Steve.
I'm an agricultural economist, and I looked at the title of this and saw the words plantation and industrial agriculture and sort of say, well, there are two things that we seem to be about to discuss. There may be more things, but two things that attract my attention. One is the scale of production, and the other is about agricultural technology. So turning to the first of those issues, scale of production, a very common debate that we have when we're looking at agriculture in the developing world is, do we need large-scale agriculture? Does progress lie with large-scale farming? And my answer to that is I'm fairly militantly on the position of saying no. Large-scale farming in the world is the exception rather than the norm. The vast majority of farms in the world are family-led enterprises. Now, thanks to capital and machinery, a family-led enterprise in North Dakota is 2,000 hectares of wheat stretching across the plain, but it's still a family business. And in Norfolk, a cereals farm will be 200, 300, 400 hectares. Again, quite a sizable area, but it's a family-run concern. And in Tanzania, a maize and bean shamba without machinery will be at most a couple of hectares, but they're all family-run concerns. Large-scale agriculture is unusual in the world. Plantations usually exist when you need to coordinate the harvesting of a crop with its prompt processing in a large-scale mill. They are there because you've very often got large, lumpy investments like processing facilities, specialized transport, and so on, and you need to get production up to scale very early on to justify the large-scale investment that you've got going. That's why we have some plantations in the world, including those of Sime Darby. But I will tell you right now, I don't know of any plantation crop anywhere in the world where there are not smallholders growing that crop successfully and at unit costs that compete with plantations and very often undercut the unit costs of plantations. So that's scale. Very clear for me, we don't need large-scale farming. We may have it in some cases, but it is not necessary. Progress can be made with family-led farms. Now, turning to technology, which is a hugely controversial area in agriculture, what I tend to see there is a conflation of particular techniques with what happens if techniques are misused, and who has control over the technology and the way the technology is developed. But just to state the blindingly obvious, agricultural technology is obviously vital. And just to remind ourselves, there will be some people in the room old enough to remember the late 1960s when Malthusianism was running riot as world population growth exceeded 2% per annum. And it seemed only a very short matter of time before Malthus would be proved correct, population growth would outstrip the growth of agriculture. Well, the good news, for those of us who survived since the late 1960s to the present, is we have more food being produced per person today, with 7.3 billion people in the world than we had in the year 1970, when there was roughly half that number of people, 3.7 billion. Now, that is an astonishing achievement, and much of that is due to the social application of good technology, and its improved seeds and better animals, and its fertilizer, agrochemicals, and veterinary supplies, and its irrigation and drainage, and so on. So technology is rather wonderful. And thanks to the ability of the Green Revolution to raise yields, on one estimate, if we hadn't been able to raise yields, we would have had to use 500 million hectares more of land to feed the current population. So the Green Revolution, by intensifying agriculture, I'm not saying the Green Revolution was perfect, it wasn't, but by intensifying agriculture, it's actually allowed us to keep more of the habitats and do less deforestation and farming of wetlands than we might otherwise have seen. Now, technology, as Marco said, these days does get a bad name, and it gets a bad name because it can be misused. I mean, environmentally, chemicals, agrochemicals can pollute water, soil, and air. Irrigation can end up with salinated deserts. Monocultures can threaten biodiversity. Land can be cleared in forests and wetlands to provide profitable cash crops of one kind or another. None of those things, however, are inevitable with the technology, yeah? If we have the right kinds of education and information, the right kind of economic incentives, the right kind of regulation, we can surely make technology our servant rather than our master. Now, the other thing that worries people about technology is who has control over it. And there are reasons for concern there, because in the last couple of decades, the Green Revolution was driven by public agricultural research, paid by taxpayers the world over. Today's cutting-edge agricultural technology is controlled by relatively few companies, the Monsantos, the Syngentas, and so on, and people worry a lot about that being in the hands of private research. The reason it's there, of course, the biggest single reason it's there, is that our leaders, on our behalf, have decided we're not going to pay for public agricultural research. So fine, private sector does it. The problem is that when the private sector does it, they do it for crops and farmers who can pay the costs of the products they come up with. So we have technologies for farmers in high-income countries, and we have technologies for produce destined for middle-class markets of affluent consumers. So we end up with Roundup-ready soybeans, we end up with tomatoes with greater shelf life, and so on. Not much of that cutting-edge technology has gone into producing improvements for African farmers. That's not, of course, because those companies are incapable or unwilling to do so. It's simply the profit motive. And the Gates Foundation, for example, is now putting funds into some of those private companies to get them to breed the crops we need for Africa. So, as ever, just to conclude, there are social goals that we have for agriculture, which is all about getting the right kinds of policies, property rights, rules and regulations that can lead towards farming and food systems that are healthy, safe, nutritious, and which conserve and sustain the environment. At the moment, we're falling down on those particular goals, but the way forward is the right kind of policies and leaderships rather than necessarily picking on particular technologies or scale of farming. Thank you.
Leela.
So, is industrial farming bad for the developing world? That sounds a little bit like a size question, doesn't it? Is big better? Does size matter? Does a handful of big farmers satisfy our needs more, perhaps, than many, many small farmers? Here's what I'm saying. We need it all in the developing world. We need the big farmers, we need the small farmers, we need the whole spectrum of them. Because when you have all of them, you can achieve from the developing world what you have already achieved here in the developed world. To illustrate the point, I'll take you to what I had for breakfast this morning. There was this artisanal butter. Looking at the packaging, I would say that was a mid-sized farm that produced it, and we spread it on toast. The wheat would have come from anywhere, really. It could have come from America, it could have come from the EU, it could have come from here. And then we washed it down with coffee, fair trade, organic coffee. Someone was thinking of sustainability, a farmer in Africa. And finally, because I like my saturated fats, we had lots of bacon with it, Danish bacon. And when you put all of that together, what do you get, really? You realize that you have on my breakfast plate everything that I'm trying to tell you today, that for developing countries, if we want to succeed, if we want to achieve the level of development that you have, we need to take care of things like employment, food security. We need to earn export revenues for our countries. We need to give weight to sustainability issues. And for me, the most important thing, we need to learn how to plug the small farmer into global trade. This is not something that's easily done. And we know this because we work with smallholders all over the world. Now, I'm going to divide this presentation into three parts. First, what's industrial farming? The second, the Malaysian experience with Felda. And the third, a story that's not finished yet. It's Liberia and Sime Darby. I hope it will have a happy ending one day. We don't know yet. So when we talk about industrial farming, what is it? We've heard Steve say some things about it. We hear words like factory and intensive, makes it sound very ugly, but it is also very efficient, very productive. It is high-tech. These are not bad words. This makes it work. Now, what is small farming? The FAO says that the average small farmer in the world has less than 2 hectares of land. Imagine making a living from less than 2 hectares of land. In the US, the definition of a small farmer is someone whose annual sales, that's revenue, is less than $250,000 a year. That's about $1 million ringgit where I come from. No developing country is going to have those standards. In Malaysia, a small farmer is someone who's got less than 5 hectares. Typically, that small farmer is poor, and his yields are poor. And it's not surprising. It's because he doesn't have access to the best planting materials. He has poor agricultural inputs. He may not observe the best agricultural standards, and he's vulnerable to price, to weather, and to disease. Now, what's the difference with the industrial farmer? Industrial farmer, that's like the company that I work for, Sime Darby. right? We have access to R&D. We spend hundreds of millions of ringgit a year on R&D. We are resilient to size, to price. We are big, so we can ride the troughs of price fluctuations. We have excellent planting materials, the best in the world, and we do share it with other people. We're very good planting inputs. We know when to plant, why, and how. And we are very consistent in our production. On top of all of that, we have higher sustainability standards than any other small player in the world. Now, there's so many things that I can talk about sustainability. If you've all read about the haze in Malaysia, there's so much that I can go on about that, but we won't, not now. Now, my second point is on FELDA. Now, FELDA was a scheme that was set up by the Malaysian government in 1956. I'm going to have to be very quick about this. So imagine FELDA, the management company, that's the Federal Land Development Authority. What it did was selected 200 smallholders, each of the 200,000, smallholders, each of them roughly about 2 hectares each. And so you had between 400,000 and 500,000 hectares under smallholder production. Now, we know from experience that smallholder yields in oil palm about half that of industrial farming. Then on the other side, FELDA set up an industrial farm of the same size. Now, the earnings from the industrial farm went into a cooperative. That cooperative funded what you needed for agriculture, what you needed for fertilizer, what you needed for replanting. That's how they made it work. Then FELDA was able to take the output from the smallholders and plug it into global trade. This was artificially created to replicate what you all have every day and live with. FELDA is one of the successful poverty alleviation schemes in the third world. And that was created in 1956, which will then take me to the Liberia story and Sime Darby. We re-entered Liberia for the third time in 2009. We went in there, there have been some mistakes, there were some challenges that we had to face. Since then, we have developed possibly the most efficient, the most forward-looking systems of engaging with local communities. There's something called free, prior, informed consent. We do this meaning there's no land grab. We conduct social environmental impact assessments, high conservation value assessments, participatory mapping, which means we work with local communities. They tell us where we can go and where we can't. They do that with local NGOs. They don't do that with us. We just provide the equipment. So you can't talk about coercion as well. Most importantly, we set buffer zones of 2 to 5 kilometers from where the villages are to where our operations start. Now, you have to remember, these are subsistence farmers. So these are the areas in which they will be conducting their subsistence farming. But of course, because we are there, we are assisting them in developing their standards of farming to make it less about subsistence and more about garden farming. Now, since 2011, for 5 years now, we have been trying, we have gone knocking on the doors of just about every single development agency you can name to say, come with us, help us to develop smallholder programs in Liberia. We've been doing this for 5 years. No one stepped forward. Do you know why? The risk is too great. Liberia has come through 2 civil wars, 85% unemployment. We all saw what happened when Ebola hit last year. And if companies like Sime Darby don't step forward, who is the hope for Liberia? Do we need industrial farming in the developing world? We do. Thank you.
Martin.
Yes and no. I'll run through those and then come with a couple of conclusions. First of all, small is not always beautiful. About 150 years ago, my great-great-great-grandfather walked from Leicestershire to London. He had a family farm. Life in it was pretty shit. He knew he was going to get better prospects in London. That's why I'm here doing the job that I'm doing now, not plucking up turnips in Leicestershire. I've just spent 3 years working in India. And if you go around the villages, especially in northern India, these small subsistence or subsistence plus family farms, you don't meet anyone who wants their kids to be a farmer. You don't meet any kids who want to be a farmer. People see the future elsewhere. You look at the level of suicides there are in small farms in India. It's horrendous, the number of farmers who are killing themselves. So don't get carried away with any romantic ideas of small always being sweeter. It isn't. It can also be devastatingly inefficient. Again, in India, between 35 and 40% of the harvest never gets to the market. It's wasted. It's wasted for a number of reasons. partly corrupt and inefficient market arrangements whereby farmers have to sell in certain areas. Also things just like the lack of decent refrigeration, the lack of a cold chain, as people call it in the industry. So small can be inefficient, can be dismal, can be tough. If you look at the history of human development over the last 150 years, on the whole, moving away from farming towards a more urban lifestyle has gone with improved health, improved prospects, improved income, particularly for women. And this is starting to happen in India now. Doesn't have to be the case. You could, as Steve was saying, have small farms that work much more effectively. I'll come on to that in a tick. But historically, recently, small is often not very beautiful at all. Big is also not always bad. You can have economies of scale, you can have efficiencies, you can have precision measurement of inputs like water and fertilizer and pesticides and so on, monitored on a large scale. You can close the loop to some extent. Some of the more imaginative plantations I've seen will turn their waste into energy to be consumed locally. And you can, if it's a well-managed, reasonably well-run plantation or large agricultural activity, you can put money into people's pockets, particularly women. You improve their own prospects, you improve the health of their children because they get enough to eat. GMOs, just say a quick word on GMOs. We've touched briefly on that. I think Marco touched on it. I'm agnostic about GMOs. I think so far their benefits have been limited. People talk a lot about GMOs and the potential of GMOs. So far, I think their benefits have been relatively confined. The risks are uncertain. We honestly will have to wait a few generations to know what the impact on human health will be. But on balance, it seems that a lot of the scare stories put about by environmentalists are wrong. And environmentalists would be mad and socially unjust to oppose some of the really promising potential of GMOs to deliver real gains, whether it's engineering plants to be drought tolerant, to be salt tolerant, to fix nitrogen more effectively than applying lots of fertilizers. There was the modification of golden rice that would make deal with vitamin A deficiency, which affects large swathes of East Asia and so on. So there are potentially a lot of benefits from GMOs. We just really haven't seen them yet. Just balancing the big-small story, big can also be a complete bastard. You've got massive plantations, monocrops, overcropping, companies who have no interest in conserving soils, no interest in conserving the long-term resilience of the land as a productive resource. Plantations can also impose massive dependency. Again, we've seen this in the Indian subcontinent with tea. People would work on tea plantations. They weren't local people, they're usually imported from elsewhere. They're completely dependent on for everything, for their income, for their housing and everything on the plantation. And then suddenly there's an oversupply of tea and the planters pull out. And in some cases, people have actually starved to death because they have no other access to food. This has happened in parts of northeast India. It's a culture of dependency can be created by excessive plantations. And even well-meaning companies who talk all the talk have been affected by that because however well-meaning the company is, it's got to satisfy its shareholders, it's got to show a return. Equally small can get better. Again, Steve touched on some of this. You can have better finance for farmers, good finance packages, microcredit, things to see them through the lean years. You can tie that into good long-term deals of the sort where epitomised by fair trade. You can reform local markets and reform distribution so farmers can sell who they want, to whom they want to, when they want to. You can have technical improvements. There's a great little invention by, I think it's Johnson Matthey, I wouldn't swear to it, having a small refrigeration van which can go down into the villages. This is being developed in India, and pick up the stuff and refrigerate it so you cut down on the harvest losses. You can have information, much more information available to farmers. You look at the spread of mobiles through somewhere like India. Indian farmers are increasingly using smartphones. You can get masses of information, ways of improving their land, improving their yields and so on. It sounds wishy-washy, but you've got to come back to what we actually want agriculture to do for us. We want it to give secure supplies of healthy food above all. We want it to conserve the resources we all depend on, particularly soil and water. You can't 3D print soil. Okay, you can do a bit of hydroponics, but basically we still need a lot of soil. You certainly can't make new water. We want it to slow climate change. And we want to give people in the producer countries the best chance of living in dignity, having some say over their futures, lifting themselves out of poverty. So that's a checklist against which you judge any form of agriculture. And there are no shortage of mechanisms to do that. You can do it through international and national law. You can do it through certification. The best way you do it is through market demand. And the market does respond to demand. Sometimes it just needs a good old-fashioned dose of angry eco-activism. Nestle, who are one of the other players on the roundtable for sustainable palm oil, they only actually took it seriously when Greenpeace came up with a fantastic campaign showing people biting into a Kit Kat and biting a baby orangutan's fingers off. You remember that one? The wonderful campaign actually made Nestle sit up and take it seriously rather than more or less pay lip service to it, which is what they effectively they're doing before. Technology can make supply chains much more transparent. You can have sensors in all kinds of places, you can have cameras, you can have people monitoring it, you can get to a stage where 20 years' time, maybe, you'll hold your mobile phone over any product in a supermarket and you'll be able to get a picture of the farmer who grew it, the field it grew in, the amount of pesticides, fertilizers applied to it, etc., etc. So there are all kinds of ways in which technology can improve farming across the board, but you always have to be asking yourself two questions, really. One, what I can do. One thing we can all do is eat a more sensible diet. We partly have a problem with this stuff because we eat too much of the wrong stuff, because people make a lot of money by feeding us too much of the wrong stuff. You don't have to become a vegan. I love meat. I love meat so much I only eat it once a week. But you have to, or you don't have to, but if you eat on the whole a sensible diet with your bias towards fresh plant food, you will live healthier, you will look dead sexy, and the planet will be a lot safer. So you wouldn't actually need so much this wonderful palm oil. Palm oil is a wonderful thing. That's why it's been so popular. If we actually didn't eat so much processed food, and if companies didn't create such a demand for processed food. So it's not revolutionary. It's asking yourself what we need, how best to get it, and keeping two skeptical questions, I think, in your mind. Do local people in these producer countries have a say in what happens around them and how? And the second, just always bearing in mind, who's making money out of this and how?
Okay.
Thank you.
Shahrar.
So thanks very much, firstly, for the invitation. What I'll attempt to do in this short address is start by identifying a few of the things that the Green Party stands for in the area of agriculture and sustainable agriculture in particular, and try and frame what I'm going to say to flesh out why we want to say those things. So one of the things that we've already heard mentioned, but I don't think it's been fleshed out enough, is the idea of sustainable agriculture. Having said that, I think Martin has picked up on a couple of the key points and messages that I think is very central to this. First of all, there is a problem of overgeneralization. Of course, you can look to both small scale and large scale, and you can find good and bad examples throughout. So let's not get drawn into sort of invoking straw men when we're arguing about this. At the same time, it is possible for us to want to say, if you look in general at the way in which power plays within industrialized food chains and systems, how the local farmer is at very great risk of not being able to afford enough to buy back the crops they could have grown in the first place. That's the ridiculosity of the situation and the kind of power and at play when multinationals are calling the shots, so to speak. So absolutely we need to be, whether you call it skepticism or critical, as an end user, as somebody who consumes food, you want to be critical. I think it's good that technology can be used in various relatively trivial ways with respect to what we're talking about now. But if it is the case that you can find out and you can see, with your smartphone, how it's got to your table, okay, that could empower you. But you also will need to be asking the difficult questions about what constraints were operative at that point at which the farmer was doing that. So, for example, if you take the Gabon, President Bongo very recently opened up some plantations to rubber manufacture. So we're talking about industrialized farming, and we're assuming it's to do with food, but it isn't. A lot of it is often to do with, in this case, the rubber is going to be used by us, 70-odd% of it, in tyre manufacture. So that is, again, taking away land which could have been used for feeding populations at the sharp end and displacing indigenous populations. So when we talk about an industrialized food system, one of the difficulties that the Green Party has with it is this relationship of power and disempowering people in order for us to have, I think Leila was describing very delectably her breakfast plate. Now, unfortunately, that sounds a little bit to me like trying to have your cake and eat it. It isn't seasonal food, it isn't food which is local, it isn't food that we can rely upon having, if we're interested in food security, on a daily basis. Being brought over here, the transport has carbon-based emissions. Our desire for those kinds of meals also has implications for animal welfare. So one of the things that the Green Party has at the forefront of its mind in terms of sustainable farming is not just about looking after number one and our salivating and our desire to salivate over an endless amount of variety on our plates and being able to go to the supermarkets without thinking about what's going on in order for it to get to our plate. We also need to be thinking in terms of how is it affecting not just the ability of that soil to replenish and to deliver more on a generational basis, but our ability as human beings to leave as much and as good behind for future generations. And that is even just talking about our children or our children's children, it's quite long into the future. And that is to do with climate change, adverse climate change impacts. And at the moment, industrial agriculture is a very fast-growing form responsible for net greenhouse gas emissions, which are resulting in people halfway around the world in low-lying coastal areas like Bangladesh, for example, suffering those net consequences of our overconsumption activities. And there's a double injustice there, because they're both least responsible for the negative impacts of climate change, given their carbon footprints, and they're least able to afford the remedial action to contend with those. So if you think of industrialization in general, despite the fact that I didn't want to overgeneralize, it is absolutely the case that the power is taken away from those farmers. Think also about coffee production. Our addiction to coffee production, when we often complain about our high streets changing, morphing into, we've either got fried chickens or betting shops on our high streets, but we've also got coffee shops on our high streets. And our addiction to coffee, we may even describe it, we may wish to salve our consciences to describe it as fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate. But just check out, do a little bit of research of coffee if you haven't already, and you just see the statistics, the number of farmers who are in hock to our addiction, the West's addiction to coffee. So there's something very neo-colonialist, if I may put it like that, about the way in which this question is framed. And finally, I just want to say a little bit about science. Because I started, I suppose, my studies in biochemical engineering. And I worked a little bit in the field of biotechnology. And I was always impressed with the level of interest in that. But I refused to be excited. I refused to be bowled over by the sort of mock excitement. Because scientists, when they describe being excited about novel engineering, they try and, in my experience, bypass those key critical questions, which responsible scientists, and even scientists who are big enough to admit their mistakes, the Einsteins of this world, they can't uninvent things once the genie's out. They do worry. And it's absolutely the case that we need to, as responsible scientists, not just leave it to those industries to decide for us how we want our society to look and feel. Now, if that introduces an inbuilt lag into the system, if it can be done democratically, great. It can either be done through, in the case of GM, the European framework. They were foresightful enough to realize that the risks, the harms, the potential harms did not outweigh the potential benefits. There's nothing Luddite about that. It's precautionary, but it isn't dogmatic. It's simply looking scientifically at the evidence base. And again, we can talk about a track record of GM crops not producing any harms. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And many of the risks associated with GM technology, as thought about, are long-term and irreversible. They're not to do with things that we might be able to discover in this decade alone. And they certainly aren't based on dogmatic assumptions about the eating of GM food somehow resulting in mutations. Nobody was arguing anything of the sort. They were talking about introducing genes at a rate at which they are not in evidence through natural mutation, and worrying about, as responsible scientists, what the negative impact could be. So, sustainable agriculture, let's have a bit more of a debate, I hope, about what we mean by that in terms of what our responsibility, both as consumers and in terms of looking at how it's disempowering the farmers who are in hoc to our sensitivities and desire for endless more overconsumption. And let's also, by all means, return to a debate about GM as one of the main areas that biotechnologists have been advocating. And for certain, we need to look at what's interest is in for them. And is it really being rolled out as a matter of an altruistic enterprise? Or aren't there far better, less risky, non-technological, political solutions which will enable us to feed the 24,000 people dying a day of malnutrition and preventable diseases around the world?
So we have a lot on the table, a lot on the plate, as it were, about scale of farming, about who controls farming, who benefits from farming, and we haven't really talked about the broader arguments about food prices over the last few decades, or about, we've only really touched on the scale of improvements in yield. So there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of areas touched on. Can I see any hands or questions or comments?
We have seen some very negative impacts of biotechnology in the developing world before. For example, in India, in the case of Monsanto's BT cotton, resistant to, I think it's the boll oil, in which a lot of small farmers were sort of coerced into buying this crop in the belief that, well, I don't know, from what I know anyway, were coerced into buying this crop in the belief that it would, increase their profits. They wouldn't have to spend loads of money on expensive pesticides. And for a couple of years, high yields happened, everything was good, but soon the pests began to become resistant to the natural insecticide that Monsanto's crop was producing, and farmers were starting to have to spend a lot more money on more different, more expensive pesticides, and in the end spiraled deeper and deeper into a lot of debt. And I think it's been slightly picked up on suicide rates in farmers, small farmers in India are really high, and I think that the massive debt that a lot of farmers got into led to a lot of suicide, and I don't think that's a very positive impact on part of the developing world, and I'm sure there are other cases. So my question would be, is the impact of biotechnology, such as genetic modification in the developing world, always predictable? And if not, surely potential negative impacts also need to be taken into account.
Do you think that powerful governments in the EU or UN should be putting all the funding in and providing intermediate technology for farmers so they can be more plugged into the global market? Or do you think this is more of a job for NGOs?
How do you feel that crop choice plays into sustainable farming, such as the wheat agriculture in regions around the Aral Sea has led to reduction, obviously?
Could I just ask each of the panel to give their definition of what they mean by sustainable? Because without a definition, I don't know whether it's something that I would support or is worth doing. So I think we actually need, if possible, to give a definition of that.
Okay, so I'll bring the panel back in on those questions. I'll just do it in the same order we started with. So, Marco, if you've got any comments or...
Well, maybe first thing about farmers being coerced into buying BT, I think the opposite is, I don't think it's very true. I think actually you can see that there's pirated BT cotton being promoted in India, which is a sign that apparently these farmers want it. Then sustainability definition, actually, it's also what Shahrar wanted us to do, right? Like have a debate on what is sustainable agriculture, what do we mean by it? I think I know what it means. I think it means backbreaking work. Very long hours praying for rain or sun and just hoping that it'll be fine. Have your kids probably work on the farm there as well. It's kind of the work that I don't think any of us would really want to do. I think that is what sustainable agriculture is. And yes, as Steve says, that maybe modern industrial agriculture may be an exception, but it doesn't mean that we should be okay with the fact that there is so much subsistence farming going on. I mean, let's say a 5-year-old in perfect health who is not on the direct threat of malnutrition, diarrhea, malaria, HIV, you name it, is also an exception. But it seems that that's an exception we would like, right? So, but anyway, yeah, sustainable agriculture, I think it's the kind of work that nobody really wants to do.
Steve.
Apologies for pulling a face when you put the good question about Indian farmer suicides. I spent a couple of hours this morning reminding myself of the arguments around the Indian farmer suicides, and apologies for the face. Look, what we know about the Indian farmer suicides is that some people have argued that, well, you know, some people have even said Monsanto is killing an Indian farmer every 30 minutes, which is a very considerable exaggeration. Marco has pointed out that the use of BT cotton has become tremendously popular because BT cotton saves on using insecticides. And that's the whole idea of BT cotton. Cotton has traditionally been the filthiest crop in the world. It's a beautiful, white, fluffy thing, but it's the filthiest crop in the world. In the past, it's been responsible for using about half of the pesticides used in world agriculture on a single crop, cotton, yeah? So it saves on that kind of thing. It does produce higher yields. It does produce better farmer profits. And there are detailed studies of the farmer suicides which look at whether it's got any association with BT cotton. And we find farmer suicides prominent in about 5 states of India, some of which have very little cotton grown at all. And what the studies I've been looking at have argued is it is to do with debt, but it's not debt necessarily that's got anything to do with BT cotton. It's in those states where financial liberalisation has led to the previously publicly owned banks having the freedom not to advance credit to farmers. Farmers have then found themselves going to private money lenders, lending at very high interest rates, and some of them then get a crop failure and end up in a situation where, unfortunately, they've taken their own lives. So the suicides are a tragic event and clearly something to be worried about. But what I'm reading says that what we need to be thinking about is the financial system, not the choice of crop. Leela.
Let me address the question on sustainable farming first. When we talk about sustainable agriculture, there are 3 pillars that we look at: people, planet, and prosperity. I didn't say profit, I said prosperity, partly because the head of sustainability of Sime Darby said it sounds more engaging, like we embrace people. So what do we mean by people, the stakeholders? Every stakeholder. That's the shareholders of Sime Darby, obviously. Sime Darby is possibly one of the largest CSR projects in Malaysia. Our shareholders are poor Malaysians who hold unit trusts, and they own 55% in Sime Darby, so that's a huge responsibility. They expect us to execute ourselves well. So we do our business, we do it right. All the communities that work with us, we engage with them, we make sure that they are well taken care of. Then the planet. We're very careful about environmental inputs. We don't burn. We have a 30% savings on fertilizer as a result of that. And we are looking at moving towards a zero carbon emission target. We hope to be able to achieve this soon. I probably shouldn't say more about that because that's a big announcement that someone else wants to make, but that's the direction in which we're going to go. And prosperity, we are always focused on the bottom line. We try and reduce cost. We manage all these situations. And when we do it now, we always keep in mind future generations. Sustainability doesn't end today. It's about the future as well. So there's that. On the Indian suicides, I don't know a lot about it, but through one of the other forums that I'm a member of, I won't mention the name of the company, what Steve talked about, that's exactly what's happening. It's the financial system. And that company, we had long discussions on how they're going to address the issue, because what they want to do is address the financial situation to help those local farmers. Okay?
Okay, great. Martin.
Definition of sustainable development. It's a process which gives everyone the chance of decent quality of life to fulfill their potential while conserving the life support systems on which all life depends. And if you want a short version of that, it will be live well without trashing the planet on which we need to live upon. It's relatively straightforward, and people obfuscate around sustainability. So you can then apply that definition to various things. The application is hard, but the definition is straightforward. I won't get stuck on the cotton thing. Monsanto are not the prime cause of farmer suicides in India. That's certainly definitely the case. I suspect in some cases, and I don't know as much detail about it as Steve, but I suspect in some cases some farmers did get over-excited and had BT cotton overhyped to them and got more into debt as a consequence. But a big foreign company is always an easy thing to give a kicking to. And the problem, to be honest, is more structural and deeply ingrained. I think one of the interesting things about looking at technology, cotton, as Steve says, is a dirty crop. It's a very thirsty crop, as well as a crop very vulnerable to pest attack and therefore needing a lot of agrochemical input. It's not necessarily going to be around in 30 years' time. There are lots of other ways we can produce things to wear that won't involve growing cotton. Cotton is, it's nice and fluffy to wear, but with the advances in upcycling and 3D printing and distributed manufacturing, et cetera, who knows? Cotton may be seen as a really sort of stupid thing that we relied on for a few thousand years, and now we got better ways of clothing ourselves. So the speed of technology can surprise us in many ways.
Okay, Shahrar.
Well, Martin, I like your definitions. It's a bit like John Locke talking about land use. You need to leave it as much and as good for the next generation. We're well beyond that point. So we do need to ask and entertain difficult questions about, I think the one part of this equation which is being missed is what we can do about our own overconsumption activities. We can't just assume that we can have our cake and eat it. We can't. We're talking about, leaving enough for the next generation, but there isn't going to be at this rate with the temperature and carbon rises that we're experiencing globally. In terms of this farmer who we're either over-romanticizing or pretending that it's the most direct existence on the planet, I think the reality is in between, obviously. There are many people who, even in this country, you will see very large waiting lists for allotments, particularly in London. And it's being used as a therapeutic exercise, you'll find. People, whether or not, consciously or otherwise, people will tell you, just in terms of the kind of community that you come across on these allotments, the sharing that goes on, and at the end of the day, our contact with the soil. And what the Green Party is proposing, just in terms of our own country, is more food growing, local food growing projects, allowing food growing in schools to let people get a bit more understanding. So I don't actually think that our large concretized cities is sustainable. Not just in terms of water runoff and all the rest of it. I think that is actually depriving many of the youngest in society from having a better idea about where their food comes from. So it's a far bigger conversation. It's a conversation about quality of life. It's a conversation about what are we picking off the supermarket shelves and what's the nutritional value of that. Has it become homogenized? Is it supposed to appear in one particular way because apparently we prefer it that way? Well, I don't. In fact, generally speaking, I find the correlation between an irregular shaped vegetable and the quality of the taste and the nutrient value. In terms of, there was a question which I think hasn't been answered yet to do with politicians and NGOs, and it's all to do with trust. And when I've spoken to politicians from the African continent, for example, they're very clued up. This is the neo-colonialist element to this. Their scientists know, and science is one of those truly, largely speaking, internationalist enterprises, except we've got problems with intellectual property rights. But by and large, the scientific community, wherever they're coming from, they have a good knowledge, and they can make their own mind-ups about the risks associated with the GM, but they want to have that choice. So politicians can sometimes be trusted. It depends what our relationship is to them. NGOs potentially have a bit more buy-in from the grassroots. But whatever we can't avoid, we should encourage people to self-organise, to create unions, farmers' unions, so that they can build a little bit more of a bulwark against the kind of exploitation that's taking place. And finally, in terms of, if you want to ask ultimately on GM, yes, there may be some technology, some uses of it, which in a measured way, we can counsel. But just thinking back to one of the technologies that I was co-responsible for in a biotechnology plant, bovine somatotropin. When I found out a little bit more about that, it's cow growth hormone, and it's associated with increased mastitis in cows if you actually feed it to cows in order to increase their milk yields. That never got a product license across the EU, and rightly so, although I think it may have got one in Russia. But there again, it's the cart before the horse. It's the biotech companies putting all the investment into it, including marketing, even before they got to that stage of whether the public wants it, whether or not there are no risks associated with it in terms of animal welfare, whether or not it's good for us to have. That's the wrong way round. We need to get to a situation where the public don't feel like they're ignorant about science. You can understand the science. Don't think it's beyond you, and don't assume that you need to defer to authority on scientific matters. At the end of the day, it's truth governed. And it's something which, if it doesn't make sense to you, well, maybe it doesn't make sense.
Okay, right. I have to say that I had an allotment a few years ago in London for a year, and it did teach me one valuable lesson, which is how great farmers are. Because I would have starved within weeks. Yeah. And I definitely don't want to see any more soil. Anyway, so any further points or questions from the audience?
It's a comment on what Shahrar said, but anybody might want to comment on it. Shahrar, you mentioned what you saw as the irony of people in Bangladesh being victims of more extreme weather conditions that are related to greenhouse gas emissions, but they're not the people creating the gas emissions because they're relatively poor. Now, as an observation, there might be a fair bit in that. But people in Bangladesh have suffered from floods and weather and the vagaries of weather well before industrial society has taken place. And just to note that. And you look at it another way, it does beg the question how people in Bangladesh could shield themselves from the vagaries of nature. But it seems to me again that would require a more technologically oriented society, a more developed society. The very thing I think that green politics generally is very wary of. And as such, I think green politics on this matter is indicative of a kind of presentism, really, seeing the problem as it is now in relation to these people, but failing to envisage or consider strongly enough the possibilities for technology to transform the kind of relationship that rural Bangladeshis have with agriculture and with development more generally.
Can I just ask everyone a question? When you came to this session today, what was your attitude towards industrialised agriculture in the developing world? I mean, how many of you thought it's probably bad, and how many thought it was probably good? So how many, put your hand up, how many thought it was probably bad? Okay, and how many people thought it was generally probably a good thing? Okay, so anybody would like to comment on why they said one thing and the other?
I'm a small farmer myself, actually, and suicide is actually quite a problem in this country as well. And it has nothing to do with big business or anything like that. But actually, some of it has to do with people not adapting to change, sadly. And I say that when possibly, without being too judgmental, but people are finding it very difficult to change. But small shopkeepers have gone and small other businesses have gone. Everything has got bigger over a larger period of time. But the point that, just to follow up on what you said, Rob, there, was that I think what we don't take into account, it's been mentioned briefly, is that technology liberates farmers from drudgery And that's what you have to understand. Farming was, in this country 60 years ago, 80 years ago, was a drudge. And don't have this romantic idea of the rural idyll, because it never existed. And technology has freed up people from that. And in my opinion, I'm not as experienced, obviously, in the developing world. I have been there, and I have seen in Ghana villages that have been overtaken by big farming businesses, and it is a very painful process, I agree. But I think it's a process that is set to continue. The genie is out of the bottle, and people want an easier lifestyle, and I don't think we should deny them it.
Okay.
The divide on the panel seems to be between the people who are into various types of technology being implemented and a more moral approach, I guess. So, Shahrar's, your idea of people thinking far more about what we eat and changing our diets as a consequence of the morality. I guess I have a slight problem with both takes, in that I just don't want to have that relationship with my food. I just want my dinner. And when it comes to the technological solutions, the problems I think everybody who's arguing for those has is that public opinion is with Shahrar. So is there any meeting in the middle here? I mean, maybe as you talk through exactly what different people mean by sustainability, maybe there'll be some agreement, but at the moment you just seem to be talking at cross purposes. There's never going to be a solution here.
Okay.
I think there's an interesting dynamic with technological farming and centralization of power. When you look at kind of broad-scale trends in farming, you have a lot about aging populations within farming communities. Those people are potentially going to be liberated to some extent by technologically advanced farming. In Japan, you already see this being the case in a very kind of surreal, high-tech way. And in developing countries, there are going to eventually be similar kinds of dynamics, I imagine. But as you compare industrial farms with small-scale farms and technological solutions on them, if you control technology in a sort of industrial zone, then you centralize the kind of power and the rights to that technology. That can cause problems both with the ability to have kind of resilient communities who can access food in the long run. And also, if we look at global change, climate change, for example, you need to have a variety of redundancy, different small farms that have their own ability to control and produce food and not bottle up supply in a single place, because I think it can cause massive environmental problems and massive political problems. So there's like the internet, we could all imagine that instead of giving all our details to Facebook, we all had our own servers in our own house and controlled our own data. There's a danger with farming technology that we put it all in one place and kind of lease it from big people who you give them a lot of power and influence. Happened already in biotech, and it could happen in a lot of other fields.
One of the issues I have is the clear-cutting of high-density oxygen-producing forests for industrial farming, because there's more profit in the crop that they're going to grow versus the oxygen they're gaining from the forest that's before them. And that, to me, is one of the issues that has not been discussed. And the need for that clear-cutting, do we really need that much food if we're producing that much more?
Leela, you mentioned something which I didn't quite understand. You said that in your company, you're so big that you can weather price fluctuations. And I just wondered, I think that's almost to me sounds like a bad thing, that we have big companies that are kind of not responsive to price changes. So I suppose I was questioning what that actually means. And kind of linked to that, I guess my broader question is, what is the role of finance in all of this? So my understanding is undercutting some of the example of the Indian farmers is the problems with microcredit, which we all thought was a really great idea, but when people have looked at it in more detail, it seemed to be quite negative. So are there actually financial institutions or financial products available to farmers to kind of insure the risks themselves, or what's happening to finance, basically? Where does that all come into this?
So just brief comments from the panel at this stage. I'll start with Leela, because a couple of things have been directed at you in terms of clear cutting, things that might be levelled at the palm oil industry. So any,
Yeah.
you don't have to answer those.
Yeah.
But
Let me explain the price fluctuations question first. Today, CPO price, that's crude palm oil price, is roughly about 2,200 ringgit per ton. your cost of production for someone like Sime Darby is about 1,400 ringgit per ton. You have less efficient players, usually the smaller ones, who are going to go up to about 2,000 ringgit a ton. Then you start seeing the margins being very, very narrow. There are a lot of smallholders today who have actually pulled out of the industry. They're not harvesting anymore because it's not worth their time to do so. Now, if palm oil price actually drops to below 1,009, as it did briefly a few months ago, you'll find on a large scale smallholders withdrawing. They will find something else more profitable to do with their time. What is the point of going into the estates, harvesting, getting the oil, and then paying more for it than you're going to earn, right? So a company like Sime Darby, because of our sheer scale and size, we can weather that. So when you have the prices coming down, that's when you see us accelerate replanting. Then you see us doing other things that are less productive with the time because we can wait. The balance sheet is strong. I myself have lived through some 5 different price cycles. So the older you get, the more you realize that everything is a cycle, and we can weather that. So that's the price fluctuation one. The question on forest preservation, those of us who are members of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, we don't clear forests. I can't remember who asked that question. We don't clear primary forests. That's part of the creed. We just don't do it anymore. Sime Darby hasn't done that, going back, I think, 15 years now. We don't clear high conservation value forests. We don't clear primary forests. So the areas in which we're actually planting would be degraded forests. Even that is now being reviewed, and we're looking at carbon measurements, actually, to see how much more we can conserve instead of planting.
Okay, Martin.
Bangladesh, interesting point, because actually in the Sundarbans and the low-lying islands and the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh, there's actually quite a lot of technological, I can't remember who asked the question, but quite a lot of technological improvements there, particularly the combination of mobile phones and solar power bringing electricity to the area. It's way off the grid, and mobile phones allowing early warning systems for when the floodwaters are rising. And you're quite right that people in that area have been living with rising and falling waters for a long time. The main problem they're experiencing at the moment is more salt intrusion, which is possibly related to sea level rise. It's a complex story, and I won't go into all the details, and it's quite, I say, quite complicated. But it's an example of technological adaptation underway. I very much hope there's not a dichotomy between technology and morality, with the sort of implication that technology is somehow immoral. I think we all want sort of deeply socially progressive application of technology. I don't think Shahrar was arguing that technological improvements are somehow immoral. At least I hope not. They'd be more entertaining if he did, maybe. I thought you asked a very good question, chap at the back, about resilience, because that is an awkward one, and there are areas in which we can look forward to being more resilient, more self-sufficient, if you like, and energy is certainly one of them. I'm an optimist for renewable energy, and I think in a number of decades we will have a successful, functioning, largely decentralized energy system. It does get harder when you talk about food, because there are all sorts of things in terms of the way the market works, in terms of competitive advantage, in terms of people getting good stuff at low prices, which are in favour of global trade in food. At the same time, if you had an enormous plague came down tomorrow, which cut everyone off, then we'd struggle in Europe at the moment. And we would have struggled a lot less 100 years ago, because we grew more of our own food. Forests, yes, finding ways to value forests. I mean, it's an old chestnut. There have been people wrestling with this one for ages. Forests definitely play a hugely useful role as a carbon sink, and they play a useful role in local water cycles, rainfall cycles, and so on. And we have to get better as a society at ascribing an economic value to that which we all benefit from, because certainly, historically, cutting forests in the Amazon and more recently in Cerrado, however it's pronounced, in Brazil is, for Cerrado for cattle grazing, and rather for soy growing in order to feed cattle. It's absolutely stupid economically, but unless you can reward people for keeping those forests in place, we struggle. And some of the best sustainability economists in the world have been working on this, but it's extremely hard politically to crack. But we need to find a way of doing it. Okay. I'll shut up now. Yeah. Oh, microcredit. Sorry, microcredit's great. There have been some ways in which it's been marketed and applied in India in particular, which gave it a bad name, but the basic principle of microcredit works really well, and it's helping people right across South Asia and Africa move from kerosene lighting to solar lighting, which is one of the simplest things you can do if you want people to have a much better quality of life. It's helping them do that and making it affordable. So the basic principle of macro, brilliant.
Shahrar. Well, firstly, thanks, Rob, for asking that warm-up question, because it's really opened things up a bit. I think some challenging questions there. I would say that technology certainly is not intrinsically immoral to pursue, in the same way that politicians aren't intrinsically immoral. But I do plead guilty to advocating a value-laden politics. And I think that one of the problems with politics is that morality seems to be something of a dirty word, or it's the economy stupid, or the bottom line is the bottom line. I disagree with that approach to politics. I think that we do need to think about moral precepts, like, are those in Bangladesh suffering a double injustice from the net results of our overconsumption? In terms of that question, it absolutely is the case that extreme weather events are happening more frequently, and UN statistics bear this out. There are quite a lot of reports which are bearing this out, and even in our own country, Tewkesbury, Boscastle are recent episodes of that. So it's not something which would have been happening without the kind of industrialization that we've experienced in the last century. There's nothing more painful than an uninhabitable planet either. And if we don't fix the kind of overconsumption which food agriculture is contributing to, whether it's our addiction to coffee or other things, we can ask those difficult questions. We might result, because I'm still a fan of, and will remain so, democracy. And if people aren't going to be won over through persuasion or through the ballot box, and if they risk tipping over into that climate change tipping point, then yes, that's our destiny. But we should make no mistake about where we're heading at the moment. The word resilience was mentioned, which I think is absolutely important to us. And whilst it may well be the case, and I know suicide rates generally have increased due to the austerity measures of this government, it may well be the case that it's not a very appealing lifestyle. I don't think we need to argue for that. We do want to ask those who want to continue to do that kind of work, they can do so in more habitable circumstances. Those who want to remain in their cities, but have at the moment remained oblivious to where their food is coming from, there should be more opportunity for them to do that, because I think it's quite an instinctive thing. I think it's almost in our genetic makeup to want to have a little bit more contact with the soil, and I think it is unnatural for us not to be able to do that, and I would rather increase the opportunity to do that. Our food security is very poor in London in particular. We're very vulnerable to oil shocks, maybe to oil refinery strikes, and I think we do need to increase resilience. There are transition town movements even across London, and I think, people trying to get together and salvage and save food, whether it's picking apples and all the rest of it, I think that is an important part of our resilience. Finally, I was at a launch event of the ODI, actually, Steve will be interested to hear, and they projected that the Sustainable Development Goals, that one which we would probably meet by 2030 would be that there was a net increase or sustainable, the amount of deforestation would actually have actually stopped at that point, in terms of the net forest that were still, around. But it's still a way off, and we do need to consider that in terms of those sinks, which are vital to our future sustainability.
Okay. Marco.
There was a lady here up front, I think, asking about, do we need all that food? I was reminded of, so there's this study being done by Jesse Oswell at Rockefeller University, and he introduced the term peak farmland. We could be at peak farmland, meaning that we don't need to clear cut any more land on our planet to produce enough food and to produce more food for a growing world population. We can get there if we modernize agriculture, because with the higher yields, we won't need more land to use for agriculture, because that is the thing. Another thing with modern agriculture, it frees up nature, basically. It not only liberates farmers, as we heard, it liberates nature as well, because we can give back land to nature, basically. Whereas if we do it on, on a smaller scale, we will need an area that is just much bigger. Also with precise agriculture, that's another, or precision agriculture, I think that's another new term coming up. We can save lots and lots more water than we are currently doing. I think someone at the back said, and I couldn't hear it properly, but I think you said about you don't want to have a connection with food, right? It's what we hear all the time, of course, and we heard that here at this panel too, right? It's the supermarkets, there's lots of stuff from all over the world. It's not all local, it's coming from everywhere, out of season. It's all, all this gigantic diversity being put in a negative context. I can somehow see that we have lost this connection if I ask my kids to draw fish. My daughter comes up with, what is it, a rectangle? Is that how you say it? It's fish sticks. So I can see she lost some connection there. But then again, the loss of connection is a sign of civilization in a sense. I mean, we killed animals on the dinner table, I think, back in the old days. None of us old enough to remember, by the way. And then civilization kicked in and we sort of moved that out of our sight, and until the point where we're now longing, some of us longing back to the good old days.
This thing about family scale farming, it is a way forward. You can make small changes year in, year out, and improve both the technology, the output, the sustainability, farm incomes, and so on. It's what we've seen in many parts of the world. And taking up the theme from the back there, one of the most fascinating things about world farming is we still have an enormous diversity of crops and animals, farming systems, techniques used, and so on. We still have a tremendous diversity in there. There is a policy challenge about preserving the agrobiodiversity, the full range of land races of different breeds that have been created over hundreds of years. And at some point, we need to start rewarding farmers for conserving that biodiversity for us, because that is a long-term cultural inheritance, and it is a bulwark against sudden changes. By the way, that diversity of agriculture is also an argument for trade, because the diversity of agriculture means that even in a future world of more extreme climates, somewhere in the world we'll get good harvests. And we're going to need more trade in the future to even up consumption across the world. Somebody asked the intriguing question, where are we on farm finance? Oh my goodness, if anybody wants to stay till about 8 o'clock at night, we can take this one forward. Look, but the simple answer is that if you take smallholders in Africa, very, very few smallholders in Africa, less than 1% at the moment, have access to formal finance. And it's, an enduring problem of African agriculture and how we develop rural financial systems. Nobody's got the answer to that yet. But my goodness, there's some exciting things going on in East Africa, and particularly Kenya, where we're watching those spaces very closely. And there is the possibility that we may get breakthroughs on farm finance. But for the moment, the simple fact is most African farmers have to manage off their own cash resources and so on.
I'm going to ask the panel to come back in and give 30-second take-home messages each for their summation of their position. I'm sorry it has to be that short, but any last urgent points? Just people want to get something off their chest. Yes, there's one here at the front.
Yeah, well, I'm very much in favor of innovation, technology, and also industry, to help the developing world in agriculture. I had a bit, my profession to do in India, and I refer to what Steve said and other people said. I mean, the BT cotton story for India is a big success story. The adoption rate of BT cotton in India is plus 90%, And there's a say, which is, you never fool a farmer twice. So farmers are quite clever people. They know how to run their business. And the reason why they come back to these technologies is because there are a lot of benefits. And this technology has transformed the communities because higher income, people can spend more money. The whole value chain is becoming richer. So more schools have been built. So it's really a very good story which can show the positive impact of modern technology. So from my point of view, it's not there's too much of that technology being sent to the developing world, but what I see as the biggest problem is for the developing world, especially in Asia now, is that we are importing our panics partly and our angst culture, which is presented here also on the platform, to these regions. I think if you're in India, if you're around in Asia, many of these countries are very, have realized all these campaigns that start very much in Europe, and then they become concerned. And most of the times, actually, they become concerned without any scientifically based reason. They become concerned because of junk science and because of political campaigns that we start in Europe, and they have a very bad impact in the developing world, very often, be it Africa or be it Asia in these days. A question to Steve. You said, I think rightly, that the Western governments have stopped kind of these developing programs like we had in times of the 70s with the Green Revolution. But then you blamed industry for doing the research. Now you could also blame the politics. And I wonder, why is that the case? How do you see that? Why have these governments stopped doing this important work and shying away from that?
Okay.
I think we should talk more about what we leave behind for future generations or even this generation. What is a therapeutic exercise is worrying about the food miles or whatever is on your plate, or feeling guilty about what you're eating on your plate in terms of the environment. So I think I don't want my children to grow up in a world where that's the case. Okay, I think we need to move the discussion away from how you live a sustainable lifestyle towards one which is a discussion about what progress means, what progress for people, progress for civilizations. Because I think the discussion of sustainability is a way of avoiding those types of discussions and putting people back at the center of notions of progress.
Okay.
I might be digressing here from the general discussion a little bit, but I just want to make a quick point about the relationship between business and NGOs. And in my interaction with palm oil companies in Indonesia, I found that they were all very critical of the NGOs who've unleashed this massive campaign against palm oil, and they talk about how it's affected industry and how NGOs don't understand how business is done, and demanding more and more voluntary regulation, blah, blah, blah. And yet, businesses sound so defensive, using all the right NGO buzzwords, sustainability, community engagement, FFP, and all the rest of it. And now we have an extraordinary situation in Indonesia, where the top 5 palm oil companies have gone off and pledged zero deforestation, and an elected government has to plead with the companies to consider the consequences for small farmers in Indonesia and the consequences it might have for the Indonesian economy. So the question really is, is that part of the problem, and why can't businesses actually stand up for what they do that is good business in and of itself, and why do you feel the need to pander to NGOs?
Okay. Yes?
Yes, so the question of morality has come up a couple of times, and my hungry friend on the left here, who's now left, said he didn't want to make a moral choice when he has his dinner. I think that's really interesting. As a consumer, I find that my moral choice is one between environmentalism, or protecting the environment, and protecting the development of the developing world. One fitting example, since we both have the Green Party and the palm oil industry on the panel, would be that of the European Union biofuel policy, where the Green lobby lobbied the European Union to sort of ban or put palm oil in a less advantageous group, effectively inhibiting developing world's exports and inhibiting their access to European markets in what is basically trade protectionism, or with the excuse of using the environmental concerns to stop that from happening. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take the panel in the reverse order to which we started.
Yeah,
So,
okay, I'll give you one sentence. Albert Einstein. It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity.
Oh, okay. Brevity. All right, Martin.
With the greatest respect to the gentleman who raised the question about progress versus sustainability, bollocks. It is not a dichotomy. Sustainable development is about progress or it's about nothing. That's why I started off by saying it's about helping people reach their potential and have a decent quality of life. It's about that or it's pointless. On a good, happy note, when I was 21, 22, I was living on a diet of instant mashed potato, pork luncheon meat and baked beans. My kids at that age were foodies. They were cooking all this wonderful food and get excited about food and the potential of food. And I think that kind of way of engaging with the delights, the qualitative delights of good eating is the kind of thing which leads you down the right kind of path without even thinking about it, rather than eating processed junk. So God bless them for that.
Okay, Leela.
The last two questions, fantastic. I wish I'd had them earlier because there's so much we can talk about in that area. Balance between development and environmentalism, that is the big debate that we're all going through right now. Coming from the place that I come from, it's a huge debate. How do you justify keeping the forest in place when there are people dying, children are dying, and there's not enough food? That's a question that we grapple with all the time, and that's the government's problem. We don't pander to NGOs. We believe in sustainability, and that's why we practice it. In Indonesia, I know what the government has done, and it is telling, isn't it, that deforestation pledges from big companies, we're being asked to backpedal so that smallholders can keep up. Now, what does that tell you? Who's the one which side of the coin is guilty of damaging the environment? Now, the one takeaway that I think we all need to keep in mind is we need to feed the world, and we need to feed the world with healthy food. We can't do it depending just on smallholders.
Okay, thank you, Leela. Steve.
Can I have 2 hours just to repudiate what Leela said? Family farms are feeding the world at the moment. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. That's an empirical fact. Look, the one sentence takeaway on this is political leadership. Yeah, we live in complex worlds. Issues of technology become very complex. People bring in values and morality. We need leadership. I love what Shahrar said, the politics of values. We desperately need the politics of values. So for me, it is about leadership, it is about vision, it is about public getting the message to politicians, providing the evidence and so on. And there was a very specific question, which is, why do we not have public funding of agricultural research if directions of technology matter? I'm sorry, the answer to that is very poor leadership. People got terrified after 73, 74, which was a colossal price spike on world food markets. And then when the Green Revolution fixed the problem of absolute supply, politicians got totally bored by farming and abandoned the field and said, we don't have to publicly fund agricultural research. That was a mistake. They're coming back in after the events of 07, 08, but in a word, it's all about leadership.
Okay, finally, Marco.
Last week there was I got a post on Facebook. Somebody wanted me to sign a petition on the Move On website to allow for GM field testing of golden rice in India. And by the way, I didn't sign it because the blindness you get from for eating only rice, and I think it's more healthy if you have a diverse diet, of course. But I was thinking, guys, this was at least 15 years ago. What have we done in the meantime? It's crazy. Of course, there are uncertainties, but we can monitor closely what's happening. There's uncertainty with everything in life. And to morality, I mean, I'm all for morality, moral judgment, and politics based on moral values. The question is, what is your moral standard? And the Greens may think that is our vulnerable Mother Earth and nature and the environment. I think for me, it's human life. And that is, I think, they benefit more from allowing GMO.
Okay, can we thank our panel?